to take is to see what are various explanations for why it is that we are studying this subject in the first place. Why do we have a problem, and what has driven the problem? And so, in the critical social sciences, there is an impetus to distinguish between addressing the surface level manifestations of a problem to fix it with short-term solutions, and then on the other hand, there is an approach to look at structural drivers or root causes of why we have problems, so that there might be a better understanding of maybe tackling the problem at the source, right? So, so if that is a agreeable approach, then is there a common universal understanding as to what is the root cause of ecological problems, why we have to study environmental studies? The answer is that there isn't just one universal idea of what the root cause is. There are many ideas as to why we have an ecological problem at our hand, why we have a climate problem at our hand. And so in the various weeks, I will tackle one after another explanation for why we have an ecological problem. And this week's focus is to think about population-related issues. So there are, even before climate change came into our radar, there have been concerns that we have too many people. Too many people equates to too much consumption of resources. Therefore, we have an ecological crisis because we just have too many people, and we have overshot, or we will soon overshoot, the so-called carrying capacity of the Earth. So these sorts of ideas have been around for a while, and so there, there are classes that are taught on population and environment, or population demographics, or population geography, in which you would learn a lot of nitty-gritty about how do you measure various things such as birth rates, death rates, total fertility rates, and what the carrying capacity means. But we're not going to go into a lot of detail in those specifics. We'll try to understand what the discourse is, what some of the issues and debates that come up are. I'll sort of take you through some of these sort of conversations, but first of all, I wanted to do my brief pop media. I wouldn't even do a full 2 minute, but I just saw this headline last night as I was preparing for my lecture, and so it was breaking news. It came in my email inbox. So apparently we had a milestone moment yesterday, but for the first time, the total number of births was exceeded by the total number of deaths in China. And so this was being discussed as a problem for economic growth. So there are these sort of various issues that are discussed in tandem with one another, and there seem to be different points of view. For some groups of people, having too many people is a problem. For some groups of people, it seems like not having enough people of a certain age range, meaning productive, being able to contribute to the workforce, not having that enough of that age range, people in that age range seems to be a problem. And for decades now, I think countries like Italy, Japan have been discussed as countries where the population pyramid is inverted. What that means is that, another one of the demographics jargon, a population pyramid is constructed of various tiers pertaining to different age groups. So from birth to, 10, 15, you could construct population pyramids at various intervals. And so if you stack the various layers of age ranges and how many people in a country exist within that age range, you get a pyramid of sorts. And so it's deemed to be undesirable if it's an inverted population pyramid where you have a large proportion of the population that are elderly, needing social security benefits and so forth, and not enough people in the working ages to support them, right? So these sorts of issues come up in population studies. Anyway, I thought this was an interesting issue that I'd share very briefly. But China has come up China and India, I would say, are two countries that come up a lot in conversations about population and environment, especially those people who have, a self-professed interest in environmental, the state of the environment. There has been a tendency to, think of it as a concern that there are some countries in the world where there are too many people, or the birth rate is very high, and even as the birth rates are going down, that the momentum already built up because of high birth rates in previous decades means that populations will continue to rise. And so these sort of concerns have been there for quite a while. Why do you think that China and India have, do you think that, is that a true statement to make, that environmentally concerned people generally tend to be concerned about population? And when population discussions come up, like the names of countries that come to mind tend to be China and India. So I made two assertions. Are they generally, do you think of them as true? So what have you heard in these respects? Could I hear some narratives?
I've heard that just because they have a large population, their impact is disproportionate because of their lifestyle. Whereas like one family in America's suburban environment has the impact of 50 people living in China, so that the numbers don't really matter because of style of living.
So what you're sharing is a critical counter argument against the idea that too many people is a cause of concern, right? What you're saying is, wait, maybe there are other things going on. Maybe it's not the number of people, but the way in consumption lifestyle might have more to do than, in terms of environmental impact. What else have you heard, Iris?
I feel like Western countries have also had some control with those kinds of regions as well, with the necessities that they have and what they allow. Like for example, with Monsanto and the fertilizers, and I read some things from the Great Derangement, and things that aren't really put in the media, just the differences from westernized colonies and compared to China and India, things that are put out there aren't really as urgent as it is in westernized colonies, if that makes sense. Just the display of media and information and how it's exchanged between countries as well.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying speaks to what rises to the surface or top in terms of what is important to talk about. So what does the media prioritize as relevant issues? If we're talking about environmental issues, so I think you're sort of agreeing that population issues in other places of the world come up to be causes of concern in the West, in Western media. And there are a lot of different issues that are already at play, but why do certain things rise to the top in terms of the popular imagination or interest, right?
Yeah.
So maybe there's something to overwhelming or disproportionate sense of importance that are placed on population issues out there, right?
Exactly.
I remember the two-child policy, which is a government-imposed policy for population and development schemes, and I remember China being part of that.
I think that China was really unique for promoting very aggressively a one-child policy for the purposes of agricultural and other economic development imperatives. But many countries have adopted a nuclear family, two children model. I don't know about all countries, but where I come from in Nepal, this two-child policy, or not necessarily policy, not very much imposed top-down, but encouragement to have no more than two children, was very much inspired by and motivated by environmental concerns. So the idea of shaping reproduction policies, motivated by environmental concerns, has sort of taken some shape or the other in various countries, in addition to Nepal as well. So in some ways you can see that if you look at media coverage as an arbiter of what is deemed to be important in a society, So you do see that Western concerns about overpopulation elsewhere has made an impact in shaping the population, reproductive policies elsewhere. So these sort of ideas and priorities and discourses are not entirely innocent because they do have real world implications for people.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, like, I feel like a lot of Western, kind of, cultures tend to blame, like, China and India a lot for specific things such as, like, air pollution or, like, water pollution, are two main ones, and kind of destroying local, like, rivers especially, a whole lot of really important animals and stuff, and around these big hubs of economy that have kind of popped up over the last, couple decades especially, but we kind of superimpose, like, you shouldn't do this, but realistically we did all of that, and we're trying to control how they go about getting to where we are, and kind of taking the same journey, and I think it's kind of unfair to just be like, no, that's terrible, you're terrible people, it's bad, and there's a lot of other mentality around it that kind of justifies that treatment of aggressiveness. Sorry,
Yeah, Kyra, thank you. So that's fair. So what you're saying is that there is a sort of there is a very West-centric idea of knowing the answers, and then it's a little bit of a neo-colonial way in which Western countries will tell other countries what you need to do to fix the issues that are now recognized, right? And I think what you're also speaking to ties back to, I think, Maeve's presentation, that in the sense that maybe there isn't a very good recognition of what exactly is driving the changes. Is it population numbers per se, or cultural practices, or various ways in which to conduct urban management and things of that nature, or is it modernization itself? So I think Maeve's presentation spoke to the ways in which an oil-based economy was being introduced to a country where there was no, I think, lifestyles were pre-modern, right, more subsistence-oriented. So there's a lot to discuss, but I think I get a sense that this group seems to be already quite well versed with some of the critical perspectives on making these sorts of assertions, outside the U.S., even as these assertions are coming out of the U.S. So that makes my job much easier, because I will be teaching this my portion of the program from a political ecology lens, and political ecology takes a very critical view of the human-environment relationship, instead of taking what is referred to as a apolitical or ahistorical approach that sort of assumes or presumes that these relationships occur in a vacuum. Rather, there's a recognition that the contemporary world is very much shaped by a history of colonialism, and this has affected various places in different ways, and as a result of that history, today there are certain groups that have more power to influence policies worldwide, and therefore political ecology asserts that one cannot study the relationship between humans and the environment without taking a more political approach, meaning that more explicitly recognizing power dynamics and how the differential power and access to resources and privileges to enjoy these resources enjoyed by different groups, how that shapes different outcomes in terms of environmental degradation or protection. So political ecology, it looks at systems of power, structures of power, and So this is what political ecology tends to do, look at power relationships in different guises, and there are very many different kinds of structures. Colonialism is a structure, we will talk about that in the later part of the term. Capitalism is a structure, patriarchy is a structure, and so racism is seen to be a structure as well. The nation state is a structure as well. So we will take a look at these various structures methodically. But for this week, for today, I want to say that the origin of political ecology as a subdiscipline was really reactionary. It was really reacting to what certain geographers and anthropologists and sociologists who were concerned about environmental issues, and they were going to places in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, and they were seeing environmentally concerned people doing things in very problematic and ineffective ways. And so they made observations and developed theories about what they were observing. And so the inaccurate and ineffective things at play they saw really constitute some of the starting point of the discipline of political ecology. So some of the problematic things they were seeing were listed in the top two bullet points. One is neo-Malthusian environmentalism, and two is the tragedy of the commons. So our seminar text will take a look at the tragedy of the commons. There's some overlap between tragedy of the commons and neo-Malthusian thinking, because the person who's responsible for the tragedy of the commons idea can be seen as a neo-Malthusian thinker. A neo-Malthusian thinker is somebody who draws on the idea of Thomas Malthus, who was an 18th century economist based in the UK. And Malthus was he was not the first person who made these observations, but he was the first person to publish it, and therefore his name is associated with it. Malthus said that population growth will necessarily surpass the ability of resource supply, and he was talking about agricultural resources. So contemporary environmentalists who draw on the works of Malthus and therefore are very concerned about overpopulation being the root cause of environmental problems are labeled as neo-Malthusian scholars. Now, this doesn't mean that population is irrelevant. It seems rather commonsensical to think that if there is a finite set of resources and so many people to support, if the number of people keep growing, then maybe there wouldn't be enough resources, right? So that seems like a very commonsensical idea. But whether or not it is supported by the evidence at the scale of the globe, it has not necessarily been supported by evidence. Yet it has, been persisted as a very, very popular narrative or trope. So let's take a look at some of the people who are behind the perpetuation of this trope. And another very quick pop media thing I would say, a few weeks ago I was watching some show, 60 Minutes, and on CBS, and this person's interview came up. Does anyone recognize him? On top right. So the clue is on the slide itself. He is a biologist at Stanford University. I'm sure he's retired by now. His name is Paul Ehrlich. He's 91 years old now, I think. But Paul Ehrlich was a very well-known name when I was a student in environmental studies, because he was a poster child for neo-Malthusian environmentalism. And he had come up with a book called The Population Bomb, and another version of the same book was called The Population Explosion in 1960s. And around the same time as Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons was published as well. And in this book, he made some very dire predictions about how in the next couple of decades, which is in the past now, that there would be some serious upheavals, and the United Kingdom as a country would cease to exist, and there would be mass huge forms of distress in the world, sort of scarcity of food, resources, and so forth. So he predicted a lot of calamities, and already at the time there was a lot of counter arguments to what he was saying. And he, in the book, in the chapter that you read for today, there is a bet that was talked about, the bet between Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simon, who was an economist. And so economists, neoclassical, the mainstream economists, tend to be very dismissive of neo-Malthusian concerns, not because they are critical about incorrectly diagnosing the problem, as political ecologists do. Economists' perspective is more cornucopian, meaning that they refuse to see that there's a problem. They're not concerned about environmental problems. So their critique of neo-Malthusianism is coming from that sort of positionality. However, even at the time that he had published this work, he had butted heads against Julian Simon and other economists, and eventually, there was a bet to see whether the price of certain rare sort of metals would increase or decrease. The idea is that if there is a scarcity, the price should increase of a number of certain metals. I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly precisely the metals in question, but Paul Ehrlich lost the bet, and the price of those metals decreased. So that in economics calculation, that means that it was not a scarce resource, or it did not lead to scarcity. But whether or not that particular bet is as telling or representative of ecological problems at large, so Paul Ehrlich apparently is still quite relevant because he's been featured in this really critical news program. So the same concerns are still there, and after this interview, there were a lot of I would say right-wing commentators that reacted to this interview and questioned why somebody whose doomsdayer predictions had been debunked long ago is still being given media space and time. But it's very interesting actually when you think about how these sort of arguments, like neo-Malthusian environmental arguments, are critiqued from very different vantage points, from critical left-leaning scholars who are also concerned about environment, but think that he's dangerously misdiagnosing the problem as overwhelmingly focused on numbers of people, whereas it should be modern, industrial, modernization, industrialized, very high consumptive lifestyles that are to blame. And on the other end, there are some very extreme conservative right-wing politicians who think that his arguments are very contrary to certain Christian fundamentalist ideologies that are trying to control population, or control promote birth control and things of that nature. So from very different vantage points. So of course in this class we're not taking that extreme right-wing conservative approach to critique neo-Malthusian, but rather coming at it from the vantage point of saying if we are if it is true that population is the problem, and we fix the problem by saying we should have a worldwide one-child policy, will that necessarily fix the ecological crisis that we have, right? Will that mean that not as many cars would be produced, or the military won't continue to be as dominant or hegemonic? So these sort of conversations really beg the question: is numbers of population really driving our overuse of the earth, or are other things driving it, right? So it is the open question. But Paul Ehrlich is also well known for giving the so-called iPad equation, where he said that environmental impact, which is represented by I in the equation, is a combination of population, but that's not the only driving force. Affluence, that translates to consumption, rates of consumption. So the assumption is that the more affluent you are, the more money you have to spend on consumer goods. So you're likely to use up more of the products that are made from the resources of the earth, and not just using up resources, but you're likely to, if you use more products, you are also then contributing to waste, right? So the earth serves as a source of raw materials, natural resources, but it also serves as a sink to absorb waste. So the more products we use, we're taking from the earth in both ways, as source and sink. And so, so the numbers of people are not the only crucial thing. Affluence, or how much spending money you have, and how much technology you're using, for your consumptive sort of lifestyle choices, that plays a part as well. So this is a very simple, oversimplified equation, but it has been made more specific, more precise by many other folks as well. It might seem surprising that a person who I'm holding up as a neo-Malthusian environmentalist thought to include other variables as well, not just population. But so the thing is that so he has a more nuanced approach than just being an extreme neo-Malthusian. But what has happened is that as a result of his work, the affluence piece has not been affected as much. From this recognition, people have not necessarily started to live a less affluent or less consumptive life. But what the impact that has happened is that in many countries, like addressed earlier, population, the reproductive choices of women particularly have been seriously curtailed because of the power dynamic between Western and sort of non-Western countries. Newly decolonized, newly independent countries have oftentimes been economically, financially reliant on Western countries, and oftentimes the development donor or sort of aid has sometimes been sort of coupled with a conditionality that the receiving country would enact very strong reproduction control policies. This specifically happened in countries like India and Nepal and Bangladesh. So the population discourse have had very material consequences in terms of women women's everyday lifestyle choices being affected, we mentioned a little bit about Thomas Malthus, but this is so neo-Malthusian apparently draws from the name of Thomas Malthus, and the neo piece suggests that the new iteration of Malthusian concerns or thinking. So some things that are important to know about Malthus. He was talking about food production, not environmental concerns at large, and he was talking about the relationship between two things growing: one availability of land and food resources, which he said grows in a linear relationship. He said it grew arithmetically, which means it follows a linear growth model equation. And then he said he contrasted that with human population that grew. He called it geometrically. He said that human beings grow geometrically, but at the time he said that. But to be precise, what he meant was human population grows exponentially, right? It follows a sort of equation that is translated into a curve on a graph. So then Malthus had predicted that because there's only so much land, and we can't have more land than we already do, and we can only grow so much food on the finite amount of land that we have. If people keep growing in numbers, then we won't have enough food resources. And so actually this is the last point is should be removed. I'll do that. I thought I would do that. He did not publish a lifeboat ethics. Actually, it was somebody else. I'll talk about him in just a bit. But a key part of Malthusian thinking in the era of Malthus was that he was very against welfare policies, economic welfare policies. He thought that people who contribute to this is a problem, overshoot is a problem, and the source of the problem he attributed to like the poor, uneducated sort of people, he said, are the ones who practice the most, they tend to have the least moral restraint, and so they tend to not be as careful in sexual abstinence practices and so forth. So poor people are the problem, and therefore if you increase welfare policies to feed and clothe the poor, then they're just going to exacerbate the problem. They don't feel like they have to work hard to sort of earn these resources, and they'll continue to, populate even more. And so that kind of thinking has also has been passed on to sort of neo-Malthusian thinkers as well. So the example, Garrett Hardin, whose very influential article we'll be discussing, is a neo-Malthusian. You will, if you have already read the Tragedy of the Commons, you probably recognize the theme, the trope, right? That too many people and what to do about it. That is that doesn't constitute the main argument, but it's a very present theme. And so he was espousing certainly neo-Malthusian talking points, and similar to what I said about Thomas Malthus's anti-poor sentiments, Garrett Hardin also espoused similar anti-poor sentiments in a global context. So earlier I said Thomas Malthus was not the one who authored Lifeboat Ethics. So we're not reading the Lifeboat Ethics, but just for context, Garrett Hardin, who published The Tragedy of the Commons, in which there's a statement that I chose the quote here: "Injustice is preferable to total ruin." And in The Tragedy of the Commons, he was talking about the ways in which a tragedy of the commons can be averted, and he goes through various solutions. And the final solution he lands on is to promote private property everywhere, because if each person is responsible for his or her own private piece of property, then they are most likely going to be responsible in managing that resource. There's a very individual stake there. And then Hardin then asked the question, how to divide the world's resources into private pieces of parcels in a fair way. And then he answers that question himself by saying there's no fair way to distribute resources equally, but that's fine. Injustice is preferable to, even if it's not possible to perfectly distribute resources equitably or equally, it will still contribute to resolving the tragedy of the commons, because in his mind, only when each person has their own piece of property to own and control, they're going to be likely to prevent that resource from a tragedy. So in the Lifeboat Ethics, the Malthusian anti-poor sentiment he showed was in the form of saying that at the time, in the 1960s and 70s, when particularly there was a massive famine, condition of droughts and famine going on in the African continent. And at the time, he published this saying that if you just hand out food aid to places that are experiencing famine, it will just exacerbate the problem of overpopulation. Then people will continue to have more babies if they just have free resources to live off of. And so, in Malthus's predictions, this kind of a overshoot moment ends in this kind of a population decline. When there's an overshoot, population will collapse. And so what he said was that things such as droughts, famines, war, disease, pestilence, he might say things like COVID are actually positive checks on overpopulation, right? So in Lifeboat Ethics, Hardin was arguing that if terrible things are happening in the world and people are dying, then helping those people is going to make the problem worse, right? So very misanthropic sentiments, which tend to be quite attached to neo-Malthusian thinking. So once again, even if the problem with neo-Malthusian is not so much that it says that the number of people are relevant to the quality of the environment, but rather the way in which the quote-unquote overpopulation problem is meant to be resolved by controlling certain groups of people, their population growth rates. It just then it goes hand in hand with the kind of othering that Kira was talking about earlier, right? It just clearly explicitly or implicitly it recognizes an in-group that is not the problem, and then it identifies an out-group that is the problem, right? And it's usually racially sort of categorized, the in-group and the out-group. Okay, so I think we sort of generally discussed this earlier. The idea of, so once again, the othering idea, when overpopulation is a point of conversation, sometimes it's not explicit, right? People can have a very politically neutral, purely environmental concern for saying we have just too many people on the planet, and then what to do about it usually lands on bodies that are outside of your own immediate environment, and there is a sort of reason for that. Demographers have predicted where most of the future population growth is likely to take place, and in most of the Western industrialized developed world, population growth rates are already going down, and there are various reasons for that that was described in the textbook, but we'll also address it after the break. There's such a thing as it's called the demographic transition. The Western industrialized countries have apparently gone through a demographic transition where the starting point was high birth rates and high death rates. Earlier, when Gerardo was talking about the constancy principle, steady state principle, I was thinking about population, because for populations to remain steady, birth rates may be high, but death rates can also be high, right? So when there are people being born, but there are people also dying, so that keeps the population more or less steady. And the demographic transition says that in Western nations, historically, birth rates were high, families had many babies, but death rates were also high. As countries become industrialized, and medical facilities, hygiene, nutrition, all of these things, education, job opportunities increased, families started to have fewer babies. That means birth rates went down, and death rates went down first because of the better life circumstances, and eventually birth rates also caught up by also going down. And so that's a demographic transition in the Western world, where death rates are also relatively low and birth rates are also relatively low. But that transition hasn't happened everywhere. And so in much of the developing world, in so-called third world countries, death rates and birth rates both are relatively high. And so that's the part of the world where population growth is going to slow down slower than in the Western world. So what that means is that even if one is perfectly neutral and not deliberately othering, or exercising, the kinds of things that we're talking about, sort of xenophobia and more racist ideologies going hand in hand with population control policies. Even if that was not happening, if overpopulation is identified as a problem to solve, then that problem-solving activity will mostly happen in the places where populations are still high. And so I thought that this would be, so this would be a way to see the othering discussion that we were having earlier. So let's take a look at this excerpt. This was from the first chapter of the book written by Ehrlich, and he describes when he first landed in India, Delhi. So is it easy to read? Looks like you're reading. picture, prepares a visual of the place that he visited. And this kind of representation of non-white populations by like white environmentalists, I think can be read as an Orientalist depiction, right? So earlier it came out that there are many kinds of drivers of environmental change, but I think Iris mentioned that in Western media, certain narratives, about other people, certain kinds of narratives come up to the top, and this is the kind of representation that creates those ideas about others that we don't usually see in our everyday lives. So it's a very effective way to paint a picture of which part of the world is overpopulated, right? When you see discussions of I've followed this for many years now. Anytime there is a population-related article in some newspaper, an image is shown of a very crowded train or overfull, bus or train in India, or very heavy traffic intersection in China, but never a very busy intersection in New York City, which is also very crowded, very densely populated, right? So there's a very it's either very unconscious, it's a form of unconscious bias. It's an unconscious way to create a visual image of what the problem is that we're talking about. And those acts are maybe meant to be innocent, but sometimes they aren't all that innocent. Okay, so I think I've been trying to present a picture of how an overwhelming reliance on population as the problem can have some problematic consequences. So basically, in environmental studies, when population issues come up, there have been three main ways in which the relationship is understood, or there are three main positions in terms of the question of what is the relationship between population and environment. So the first one that we've been discussing is the new Malthusian perspective. It identifies population as not only an important thing, but the most important thing, and it has to be fixed by introducing very strict population control policies, and it has all of these eco-fascist, eugenics implications. A second perspective, the name Julian Simon came up. It also comes up in your reading. A mainstream economist perspective says that there is what environment problem? It doesn't recognize a population problem because it doesn't recognize an environmental problem in the first place. So that's not very helpful for us. That's also referred to as a cornucopian perspective. Cornucopia is the horn of plenty, right? It's the idea that we have enough. What's scarcity? I mean, if we run out of a certain resource, humans are so intelligent, they'll come up with ingenious solutions. We can have, you can have artificial resources to replace the ones that have been used up. So then it is a perspective with some problems, but it has a different perspective on the population issue. And the third perspective, I believe, is the one that political ecology lands in. The third perspective, which does not say that we don't have an environmental problem, and it doesn't also say that population is not relevant. But what it does say is that the way to address these issues is not to say we have to reduce the number of people, but rather do other things to improve the lives of people, and automatically the number of people would also come down, because one of the fundamental conclusions that a lot of demographics work has also come to is that the best way to address population to arrive at an ideal type scenario in terms of population growth rates is to have empowered women who can make decisions about their own lifestyle choices, and to not have to rely on their husbands or their parents or maybe even top-down government policies that say, can only have one child or can only have two children. So when women have opportunities to pursue education, pursue careers and so forth, that has been the strongest predictor to families starting to have fewer and fewer children, to the point that sometimes not having enough of a working age population can be deemed to be a problem. So those are the three main perspectives in the population environment debate. And there are some notes. I think we won't go over them in much detail, but there's more details as to what some of the assumptions and the conclusions are of each of the three perspectives. The new malthusian perspective assumes that there is a fixed carrying capacity, and if we don't control the population problem, we won't be able to live within the carrying capacity. So there's a whole different discussion about carrying capacity, and I think for humans, the carrying capacity of the Earth has been a subject of a lot of contentious work, and there's a very broad range of what this carrying capacity is, and there's not a very strong consensus. So it comes up a lot in the imaginary of environmentalists, but it's very difficult to quantify in a universal sort of way. We will talk more about the economic optimism perspective next week when we talk about markets. But this is essentially a perspective that doesn't see there being an environmental problem, and if there is one, human ingenuity will overtake that problem. And some of the conclusions that it has come up with, that technology can be used to address resource scarcity issues. The Green Revolution is seen oftentimes as the answer to the kinds of predictions that Paul Ehrlich made that didn't come out to be true. But the Green Revolution itself has many issues with them. I think Monsanto came up earlier in your example. And the Green Revolution, the name is quite misleading. It sounds like a wonderful progressive thing, but it actually means using a lot of very problematic, toxic fertilizers, chemicals, using a lot of, in the machinery and so forth, taking away the rights of farmers to save their own seeds. So basically, it's a very centralized form of producing crops using large-scale agriculture. And so that so economic optimism solutions have their own set of environmental problems, even if, yes, the overshoot issue has not really come out to be true yet. So the last perspective really, once again, it doesn't say that population is not an issue, but asks why population is growing in certain places, and looks at social structures, social factors as the root causes of even population growth. So if it provides cultural and social explanations for the rationale for families to continue to have a lot of children in the present day. And so the conclusion on part of social equity advocates is to call for more equitable distribution of resources. So one of the things that the common sense idea that the more people we have, the more resources we'll use up. That kind of imaginary relies on thinking that we have this much resources and this many people. If we have too many people, there wouldn't be enough resources. That kind of an imaginary assumes that resources are being used, distributed equally, right? I think we tend to make those kinds of assertions, but there are many parts of the world where people don't use a fraction of the resources that are used by even the lowest income bracket populations in the United States, and so that kind of uniformity is not really present on Earth. And I think in Gerardo's lecture, you were talking about productivity and how it varies in different coastal zones. And so, in somewhat of a similar way, the resource use in various regions of the world is quite variable. And so, we will take a closer look at the social equity perspective, which can also be understood as a Marxian or Marxist perspective, when we look at capitalism and how capitalism is described as a root cause of the ecological crisis in the second half of the quarter. So I think we will just end there for now. Let's take a 5-minute break and come back at 2:10, and we'll resume. So make sure to take a stretch break, get some oxygen in your lungs. Organizations tell us how to be more responsible environmental citizens, right? And I will also, I guess I could say that the image of the big orange balloon that says this is 1 ton of carbon dioxide that's on your Canvas page. I took that photo in Copenhagen during the COP15 summit. I would say that invitation to do your part, that is part of this idea of individualizing responsibility. I think it has a sense of guilt-tripping people into doing things differently, and some of those, like recycling more, turning off the light bulbs, these sort of things are not bad. There's nothing wrong with using individual lifestyle choices to do your part, but this article makes a claim that at the global scale, at a scale in which action is needed, the individual actions that people take don't amount to as much. We have to make structural changes, systemic changes. So this idea has been present within environmental studies, that we have to make systemic changes. Just tinkering with individual solutions is not as effective. One example of that comes from an article in The Economist that points to how individuals can do their part by buying a different kind of product, but until the structures are themselves recognized to be the root of the problem, we can't really, hope to make very many genuine sort of changes. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try our best to buy from, try to reduce the food miles, try to buy organic, to, reduce the amount of, toxic substances that are going into our bodies and into the fields. But they probably are not the, end-all be-all solution. So one of the things that political ecology looks at is structural solutions, and therefore sort of recognizing structures that create problems is seen to be important. There's also this tension between structure and agency that is a part of a lot of social science work. So in this there's a phrase called the structure-agency dialectic that comes up in social science scholarship, and what that means is that agency has to do with individual freedom, what each person can do within the constraints, right? I can make certain choices about what I want to wear today, what I want to eat today, what I want to drink, and whether I want to go somewhere, travel, what sort of, how I want to travel. These sort of decisions each person can make to some extent, right? And I can't make a decision that I'm going to teleport myself from here to there. There are certain things that we work within constraints, we work within possible constraints. And so the constraints are the structure that we find ourselves in. And the structure could be a societal structure, an institutional structure, infrastructural structure too. I mean, I might say that I want to use public transportation, but what if I'm in a city where we don't have good public transportations? In Olympia, we do have a very good public transportation structure, and currently it's actually free to ride the bus. I don't know how long it will be that way, but sometime last year, it was made free to all passengers. So we have a good infrastructure for public transportation, let's say in Olympia. However, it's limited. If every time I have to go to the airport, it's a huge problem. We don't have a good bus. It takes 3 hours. I've done that many times because I am a coward and I can't drive on I-5. So we have so basically whether we're talking about public transportation infrastructure or in the sea level rise stay or leave debate, we were talking about economic and insurance company structures, right? The insurance company policies create certain incentives or disincentives to do or not to do certain things, and those can also be understood as structures. So basically, there are many different kinds of structures, and patriarchy is a structure that enables women to do certain things and not be able to do certain other things in certain contexts. Patriarchy as a structure operates differently in different contexts, right? So there are many kinds of structures, and within the prevailing structures, people can act, and so that's agency. And so there is this tension between what people are able to do within the prevailing structures, but structures are also not God-given, they're not naturally existing. People created them, right? So there's this interesting tension between agency and structure in that people are inhibited by or constrained by it, but people can also change the structures. And so a structural or systemic analysis suggests that people can use their agency not only to use their everyday consumption choices, but also to try to impinge on structure. So this is something that is sort of prevalent in social science. And so various structures, capitalism, colonialism, the structure of the world economy, where more and less powerful countries and so forth, the nation state can be seen as a structure as well. So, so once again, this is a little bit of a sort of diversion on the population question right now, but which is to say that in political ecology, it is deemed to be important to understand how these structures are influencing the choices made by countries, institutions, governments, cities, counties, and so forth that have different kinds of implications for climate change, right? Climate mitigation. And if we are placing a lot of emphasis on individual population growth or population control measures, that that can be done in a top-down fashion. So it can be done at the level of country, level of nation state, or at the very individual context where sort of individual couples or families make choices about how many children to have. So there can be individual or structural actions that can be taken on the population question as well, but they still don't really impinge on some of the other ways in which environmental changes are happening. So we'll take a look at some of these structures a little bit, but in later weeks. But for now, I wanted to have us think about to what extent. So I feel as if I've said a lot about the issue of population and how within political ecology there's a very you can almost say a visceral reaction to an overwhelming emphasis on population. I want to sometimes then sort of scale it back a little bit and say sometimes in political ecology people go overboard and trying to tamp down any conversations about population, where and that can also be sort of problematic because in many critical social science circles, it has become so taboo to talk about population control for good reason, because population control measures have been very troublesome, impinging on human rights of people in China. There have been some, because of the one-child policy, there have been what's the term for? There's a particular pattern or sort of tendency to select for the boy child when you can only have one child. I know that there's a strong preference for boys in Nepal and India for reasons of moving forward the family name and taking care of property, and that's changing. But some of these population control measures have had very unintended consequences as well.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it was the abortion right after they find out what gender it is.
Mm-hmm. And there's a certain name for that, a variation of infanticide, but with a gendered version of that term, I think. Okay, so then I think having said that, having recognized that an overwhelming emphasis on population is the problem, I think we can also think about the ways in which population does play a role in climate change, but also ecological change more broadly. But so before we move on, what are some of your thoughts on the question of population? Do you think that, I think before this lecture, did you have a sense that it could possibly be problematic to just think about population as an environmental issue? Or what were some of your thoughts, and what are your thoughts now?
I remember reading something about, I believe it was Haiti, and there was a big famine there. And so I think it was the U.S. sent like tons and tons and tons of rice to help feed people for several years. And so basically what happened was all the farmers there couldn't compete with the rice prices, and so they basically all went out of business. So once the rice stopped, all the free rice stopped, they essentially had no farming, native to their area. There was nobody who was farming, mass enough, and so that led to a lot of other famine, and also just this intense, like reliance on, like Monsanto coming in and giving these kinds of, plants and stuff. But also, it was kind of like it wasn't necessarily they tried to solve the problem, and then they ended up just like undermining all of the structure that was already there to uphold the local community, which kind of, led to a lot worse conditions. For the population there, and I believe it was mostly due to war, the Civil War, but it was a little bit of overpopulation. They couldn't keep their people due to losing so many people.
Yeah, so it's interesting that maybe scarcity of food because of loss could be from various reasons, but a very strong explanation or narrative that arises from public policy analysts seems to prefer the there's not enough food, there's too many people narrative, and when that narrative is there, the solution, so how you describe the problem shapes the kind of solutions. If that's how you describe the problem, then the solution comes in the form of genetic engineering companies that have always based their rationale on that idea, right? There's going to be too many people if we don't do something to produce new kinds of technologies, and therefore we have those kinds of technologies. But then what if the lack of access to food was because their land was taken away, right? And that has happened in many cases with urbanization, with private companies coming in, and people losing their rights to farm their land. And so if the problem is recognized accurately, then the solutions could be more effective. But then those kinds of solutions, giving people land, isn't always land reform as a policy solution has worked in some places. It hasn't even been proposed in many places. It's interesting. So some of these, I think one of the reasons might be focus on population might be maybe motivated by how it is possibly easier to come up with certain solutions, right? Giving people land is not an easy solution. Doesn't mean that it's not important, but it maybe explains why certain solutions are so popular. What are the other thoughts do you have, Ben?
I think for me, I feel it's less about like the overpopulation and rather the distribution of resources we have and the and how our population is laid out. Like it's like kind of moving towards more well-planned cities with grids and stuff rather than like these really curvy, spread out suburban sprawls. And the use of public transportation over everybody driving their own car. More investment into high-speed rail and stuff.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying suggests some problematizing of that population and impact correlation, right? It's easy to make that correlation, but every time there's a new person in the community, if that person was expected to drive their own car, then it would be a direct relationship. But if you have a good system of public transportation, more people wouldn't necessarily mean more greenhouse gases, right? What other thoughts do you all have? Examples? Yes, Nate.
Kind of related to like population
Mhm.
74% of the country was under the age of 14.
Mhm.
And then I was there in 2011, and I know like on my time on the ground seeing the population disbursement and the ages,
Mhm.
there was these huge gaps in between. And in
Mhm.
the denser urban area, it kind of fit the stereotypical image of being this negative environment,
Mhm.
but it wasn't so much to do with the population, I think because of that. There
Mhm.
was
That's so
big
interesting.
gaps between there was only 10% elderly and it was
Uh-huh.
like 60% of this group, and there was not room for that function to be.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, and I think the example I gave was of an inverted pyramid with more older people and less of the younger working age people. And I had presented that as an emerging problem in many countries like Italy, Japan. But what you're pointing out is another iteration of an unbalanced population pyramid, right? Where for society to function culturally, for there to be elderly people to give sort of wisdom and advice to younger people, to produce maybe some cultural constraints can be a good thing, especially in according to the cultural context. And I think what you're sort of painting a picture of is maybe a place where maybe too much youth military activity without sort of those sorts of constraints might lead to instability.
And become environmental instability,
Mhm.
because the methods of farming and things deteriorated over there.
Mhm.
We provide security for education centers where people came from the Canada, which to these people is considered a different country, but to
Mhm.
teach them how to redo their fields again and be successful, so
Mhm.
prevent the famine that you mentioned
Mhm.
in Haiti,
Mhm.
where because of intervention, these people were left atrophied in their own environments.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, thank you. And maybe sometime we can chat about Afghanistan. I spent a year in Kabul. Did you spend time in Kabul?
No, I was in the Sandan in the Helmand province along the Helmand River, about 8 miles away from the Kachaki Dam.
Mhm.
It's very interesting because all the population's on the river, and then when you get into the brown zone, it immediately just, you can't, it's not that it's unsurvivable, but people are drawn to the water.
By the brown zone, do you mean urban?
No, we
Built
called it the
environment?
brown zone because literally on one side of the highway it was brown, and on the left side it was a tropical environment almost because of the valley,
I see.
and it was just completely different.
Thank you. And Hera?
Yeah, another thing I thought of during the presentation was greenwashing and kind of that pushing the responsibility onto consumers, wealthy consumers specifically, and then having brands come in and take advantage of that when they're like not necessarily giving you something that's any better, like it's like a green, good for the planet, like a advertisement, and then you just look at it and it's like it's still a plastic blanket, it's nothing special, or the plastic bottles with paper around it essentially, and it's also like I remember seeing it was like a sign that was like, oh, don't litter, like that kind of stuff, and it was sponsored, and it was like a really small cleanup program sponsored by a company who had been fined, a slap on the wrist equivalent for like dumping, whatever 20 tons of ash into a river, and it's like it's not, it's just always pushing it onto the consumer, which is understandable, but it gets overwhelming. As a consumer, you almost have to study and know exactly what is good, and you also have all these like, oh, it's organic, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything for certain things, so it's really difficult.
So greenwashing is certainly a very problematic practice. And then there are also products that genuinely try to have less impact on the environment and are better for your bodies. And so there's both of that. But it does seem as if letting the consumer choose and there be no other way to encourage those greener practices seems to be a problem, right? So instead of only letting the consumer choose, what if all products were only produced in the better way? And that would come about if the regulations were stronger, right? That certain practices would be banned if we know that those practices are sort of harmful. So that's another example of a argument for a systemic change or structural change instead of a very individual scale change. So let's take a look at some graphs, and then we'll end with a discussion on the demographic transition and then maybe positive solutions. We talked about this graph, and it's often referred to as the J curve. And I might have been able to explain this scientifically or statistically when I was a student, but I'm only familiar with it now. I've forgotten how to, explain this. It's just the J curve is it's opposite. It's different from the linear curve. It's different from a linear growth. It's a J curve is a shape that comes on a graph if growth is exponential, right? And so we know that. We know from looking at observations that the population of the world has followed a J curve model, meaning an exponential growth curve model. And there's another J curve that's recognized, observed in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And so you do see that they're very similar, and it's it's quite natural. So the graph on the lower right is a graph of concentrations of 3 specific greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, also methane, and nitrous oxide. And they follow a pattern with steep growth in the 21st century, and similarly steep growth in the population curve around the same time. And so there are many environmentally concerned people concerned about climate change, who continue to say population is the driver. And you can't fault them because it seems like they're very correlated. The graph on the top, by the way, is a graph based on actual measurements taken at observatory in Hawaii, the famous Mauna Loa curve. I think Charles Keeling, who was a chemistry scientist who thought to start taking measurements and was concerned by a very steep increase in carbon dioxide concentrations. And the graph on the bottom right is not just based on actual present day measurements, but also based on ice drilling, ice core samples, based on historical and contemporary data. So basically the idea is that there is a very clear correlation between population growth and greenhouse gas emissions. In sort of scientific studies, I think there is a sort of imperative to distinguish between correlation and causation. If two things are seen as correlated, we can't necessarily ascribe a causation relationship. One didn't necessarily come from the other, and there can be confounding variables. What that means is that we have looked at 2 variables and how they're charted in these 2 graphs, but maybe there are other variables. What other things do you think might be going on that might have influenced the greenhouse gases, if not just population? Kyra?
Using new energy sources such as coal, and then further using oil and other types of things like that.
Coal, oil, fossil fuels.
Solar energy, I know that's on the rise as well, and it's kind of overlapping and overlaying the other current resources.
Solar energy might not have created such a steep rise in the greenhouse gas emissions though, right? Ben?
The rise of plastics and consumerism. So instead of trying to repair something, you just buy the new thing.
So very high consumptive sort of consumerist sort of lifestyles, use and throw away sort of culture might be part of it.
And also, our culture has risen, or is now increasing its consumption of speedy travel.
deforestation, especially like in the Americas and Europe and Asia specifically for colonialism.
That's right. So deforestation has a connection with greenhouse gases from the other end, because if there are more forests, then they sequester carbon. Less forest means there's more carbon dioxide to be able to float around in the atmosphere. So something that happened around this time when the steep sort of curve sort of started to take off is the Industrial Revolution, right? The Industrial Revolution that kicked off in Western Europe and then practically sort of globalized around the world. Some people talk about the invention of the steam engine that has really created a big jump or shift in the ways in which people were able to pursue more convenient standards of living, a shift in the ways in which people sort of produce goods and services, manufacturing, but also transportation. There is a term called Anthropocene that is quite contested, but I think the idea of the Anthropocene is the idea of how human populations have created a circumstance where they have an overwhelming impact on the earth, right? And so what's the starting point of the Anthropocene? That's also very contested, but many points to the Industrial Revolution and the invention of the steam engine. But so basically a big part of the climate change crisis seems to be a big shift for whatever reason that led to a large-scale use of fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels, and people were already burning coal, to heat their homes, in their to heat their little spaces within the household. I remember my grandmother would always carry a little earthen pot with some coals in it to keep her hands warm inside her shawl. It's a sort of memory of her. But so people were already using coal, but then to be able to use it at a massive scale, to build economies of scale, seems to have created a shift to a much wider sort of ability to use fossil fuel, to burn fossil fuels to make lives easier. So this particular table came from your book chapter, and the book chapter presents various, something we have discussed, neo-Malthusian theories, debunking them, but also presenting a nuanced discussion. One of the things it points to is how the neo-Malthusian arguments can seem to be flawed when you look at how different the energy and other resource consumption is in different countries. So you see China has a big population, 1.4 billion. The USA has 327 million, and so forth. In terms of GDP, per capita basically means on average. You take the total for a country and you divide it by the number of people and you get per capita, meaning per person or average. And the GDP is a symbol or sign of affluence. We talked about affluence earlier, the gross domestic product, how much money moves in the economy. So you see that if you look at per capita, China is surpassed by the United States in terms of economic ability and how much is available per person on average. And the energy use per person also seems to be highest in the US in this particular chart. But if you had Qatar or Dubai or some certain Middle Eastern countries with smaller populations, high GDP, they also tend to have high fossil fuel use per capita. But so every context differs, every country differs in context. But let's keep comparing China and US because we sort of talked about China. China and India face a lot of brunt of the population sort of discussion as well. In terms of forest change, there's more forest cover in China relative to the US, but this can include plantations, so this is an aside. But the two variables I wanted to compare the most was the total population and the greenhouse gases, the first and the last in the columns. So the US has 16 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent on average. So this is how much a single individual in the U.S. On average uses. So it's double the amount that an average person in China uses, right? So then you compare that kind of statistic with the total population, and you get some absolute figures, but also at the individual level, it is, it's pretty stark, the distinctions between different countries and how much an average individual uses, right? So Bangladesh has the smallest per capita emissions of all of these 6 countries here. So if you look at Bangladesh, of these various countries, Bangladesh, Turkey, and Kenya are the ones where there have been very stringent population control measures. So if you were successful in reducing the number of babies each family has in these countries, do you think that it would have a big dent in the greenhouse gases produced in the world? So I think this kind of statistic helps put into context the concerns about population numbers only, right? I was saying last week that I came from a large family, and I wanted to share something in context. So when I was growing up in Nepal, we lived in a fairly small house, and I had grandparents that had 9 children. And by the time I was born, 2 of my oldest aunts had gotten married, so they lived with their husbands' families. But the remaining 5 aunts, and my father and his wife and children, and my father's brother, and he was not married, we all lived in the same house. And we didn't have many things, we didn't have many toys, we didn't have many material objects. We were well fed, but we didn't have many packaged foods. It was a very different kind of lifestyle. And so if I were to just do an inventory of all the things I use day to day, living in that context, and how much resources my little family of 3, me and my husband and a son, how much we use, I feel as if I could just tell easily that we use a lot more energy and we produce a lot more waste than the big family of I don't know how many, 20 plus used to produce. So it seems like a very different, ineffective use of time to only focus too much on population and to try to control the number of babies people are having in countries where the use of resources is very low, and maybe it does have an impact, but then if you're not addressing those factors that are creating really high consumption of greenhouse gases or production of greenhouse gases, then we're not really sort of resolving the issue. So that's one. What I was sharing as an anecdote, there's actually a test to measure ecological footprint. Have you heard of the ecological footprint quiz? Sometimes in classes I have that, I do that as a workshop activity, but I think I've read a lot of critique of the ecological footprint quiz because it makes people feel so bad about it. And especially the ecological footprint, if you Google ecological footprint quiz, if you're curious, you can take the quiz. And when the quiz begins, sometimes you find a version for which you have to pay. You can also find the free version. And actually the textbook offers a website address. One of the exercises in the textbook says that you can give the instructions to take this, and so you're welcome to. But you first choose a country. Once you choose a country, then you have various questions you answer. What's your everyday use of various products? How much meat do you consume? How much do you travel? How do you travel? Those sorts of questions. And at the end, if you choose the US as a starting point country, it's impossible to occupy less than so many Earths, right? So no matter how much you adjust your lifestyle choices, you still end up showing that you require, if everybody on Earth lived like you did, we would need 3 Earths. I think that is the ballpark figure. So within the U.S., there's no way we could make any kinds of lifestyle choices to have less than that impact. And this particular image is an older one. So for instance, China, China needing only one Earth. I think that this is probably changed by now. But the thing is, some of the changes that we're seeing in terms of India, China, is not just because of population, but rather because of the modernization and the rate of industrialization in these countries. So it's interesting to weigh the different sort of contributions to the issue. So this is another interesting set of sort of figures. You're welcome to play with this website to see how things differ around the world for things that you're interested in. So these kinds of maps are called cartograms that presented a distorted shape of the world based on particular variables. So the relative sizes of different countries based on variables, and this particular one shows the ecological footprint based on 2019. So it would have been interesting to show a regular size map to compare with these, but you can have a visual imaginary of the map as you know it. So you do see that if you emphasize population, some countries in Asia and Africa show up as sort of larger compared to North American, Western European countries. But if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, some countries that look very small look bigger. So it's a different way in which to do a visual comparison of different countries. And in this website, you can see different countries and how they fared in various flood situations, flood-related economic damages, damages and loss of life, and all kinds of data is available. So there's another one here that you can compare. So this is for greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions, comparing aggregate or absolute greenhouse gas emissions produced by regions of the world to the average ones, per capita averages for the same regions. So some things that stand out here. So the colors. So the blue is OECD countries. The OECD countries are mostly Western industrialized nations. And the green is Asia. So Asia, including South Asia, Southeast Asia. So you see distinction between countries that seem to be lower down on the scale when you look at their aggregate emissions, such as for the blue, and then high up when you look at the per capita. And on the flip side, the green, which is Asia, shows up to be a big culprit when you look at aggregate emissions, but when you look at average emissions, then they're less, relatively less of a culprit. So based on so if you were making an argument for certain countries to be more responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, you could easily choose to sort of present a certain kind of data and not the other kind to make your point, right? So it's possible. It's interesting that you can really manipulate data to make your point if you have a predetermined argument you're trying to make. But a better thing to do is to make more nuanced arguments by taking, by recognizing and by acknowledging that from a certain criteria, there's more responsibility in certain regions and less in others. I think I like this one. I like this depiction. This is from the IPCC's report, and it shows both per capita, which is by the height of the bar, shows the per capita or average emissions for every region. And so there's not a perfect way to categorize regions and countries, by the way. In this one, Japan, Australia, New Zealand is grouped together in this dark green, and USA and Canada are grouped together in this bright blue, and so on and so forth. And South Asia, the previous ones showed that, so this one, I like this one because it shows, by looking at the surface area of the bars, you see both a combination of per capita in conjunction with the population of the region, right? So that you get a better sense of how different regions of the world are doing in terms of their overall contributions. I think what this shows is that you can't absolutely dismiss the impact that numbers of people have. I think that some countries like India have for a long time said that our per capita emissions are so low, we shouldn't be asked to take on more responsibility to mitigate climate change. And that kind of an argument can be taken in a more nuanced way. And so there's an argument for responsibility based on historical emissions, and there's an argument for responsibility based on per capita emissions. And one can make the argument that there can also be a responsibility just based on the aggregate contributions as well. All right, so I think that maybe I'll just go ahead and before I move on to the demographic transition model that I want to end with, are there some thoughts or questions on the graphs that we've seen? There is a more recent IPCC report, which is the sort of peer-reviewed science on climate change. Every several years, the reports come out. But this was taken from the second to last, most recent one that I've been using. Okay, so for the demographic transition model, I generally talked about it earlier, but do you remember I said that population started with having lots of babies, but also lots of deaths? And the Western world followed this demographic transition model where death rates fell down because of better health services, better nutrition, easier lives, and so forth. And birth rates eventually came down as well. And for a lot of population policymakers, there's been a desire to emulate this pattern in the developing world as well. And so oftentimes to do this, economic development policies are introduced to provide education. When that sort of stuff is introduced, it's usually Western education. And so there has been a desire to have much of the third world also emulate these patterns, but it hasn't really happened as expected or desired for various reasons. And the textbook that you're reading says, among other things, that the Western world, had the third world to sort of exploit and take a sort of. So there's an unequal relationship. So the third world resources and dynamics have helped propel the first world to a level of development. And if the third world doesn't have another such world to live off of, maybe it's not as easy to emulate whatever has happened in the first world. But regardless, there has been there's been an effort to introduce so-called women's empowerment sort of programs. Typically, it looks like access to education, westernized education, which then opens up doors to have careers and so forth. And that kind of approach has been seen as more effective and less problematic from a human rights standpoint and from a sort of gender rights standpoint than specifically focusing on population control policies, which has been for the most part the norm. In order to forcibly bring down the bring about the demographic transition curve, and when that has happened, typically the impetus has been on women not being able to make decisions about about their own bodies, but also sometimes needing to go against their own desires. Maybe people want to have more children because maybe they sometimes for problematic reasons, because they only have daughters and they would really like to have a son. And those sorts of pressures typically tend to dissipate as people become more educated. But even when we're saying this, education is a double-edged sword. When you think about education, in the name of education, sometimes you just get a lot of Western indoctrination, and so there's a lot to balance. But the last thing I wanted to say on the population question was that within the environmental sort of community, there has been a process of being burnt by the by a history of trying to impose population control policies in the name of environmental conservation, and then getting a lot of backlash on it. And so today, a lot of environmental organizations are very hesitant to even bring up the term population. Sometimes there have been some really sort of forced sterilization campaigns that have been done in India, for instance, that led to the ousting of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. She was even assassinated. And a lot of those sort of forcible population control measures were, like I said before, tied to development aid as well. And so today there's a big reluctance to say anything in relation to population, but a big consensus is that providing access to education without explicitly saying population, it has the effect of bringing population rates down. All right, so I think that's the end, and I did go over a little bit, but I appreciate the conversation we had throughout, and it's more fun for me to not be talking the whole time, and I imagine more fun for you to not just have to hear a one-directional spiel. So for tomorrow, we have those two pieces. It's not going to be overwhelmingly focused on population, but maybe that's not a bad thing. We can continue to have conversations about population, but just make sure to have those two articles read. Maybe even better, bring the articles as well. We'll have a sort of interactive discussion on the two, and I will revisit the question of the tragedy of the commons in a lecture 2 weeks from now. All right, have a wonderful evening and see you tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Thanks.